Welcome to No Church Church. Today we got Phil Drysdale here with us today to talk more about doctrine and kind of the way that, what do we see doctrine? Do we take it just as kind of this shallow, quick story read, and then we start saying all these things, and then when you break it down, the first verse of the Bible, talks about good God, good God, good God, good God, and I had somebody on here the other day, and they said even in the first word, you can see Jesus, the story of sacrifice and where he would be sacrificed, and the resurrection of him, all in the first word. And to me, that's truth, and truth brings peace. For me, doctrine is hard, because basically doctrine is, hey, this is this box of our doctrine. You live in this box, you do everything we say, and then you can't look at anything outside of that box. And so for the times that you're talking about, even the Jewish people have to consider 7 different ways of one piece of doctrine before they can commit. That stretches me because I've never done that. If I was being honest.
Me neither. To be honest.
Right, I think, man, in our Western society of thinking and the way we consume information, are we failing ourselves? We're basically grasping onto quick doctrine, and then that doctrine's hurting us because it's not true, and that's one of the reasons we're doing the podcast, is because we want true doctrine, so that basically it brings that freedom and revelation. It's actually not doctrine that brings freedom and revelation. It's the truth. What does it say? The truth sets people free, and so thank you so much for coming in and sharing, and stay tuned for the end. We're going to give all Phil Drysdale stuff out so that you can connect with him on a personal level. So today we're talking about kind of the cross and what was the purpose of the cross, and how people view that purpose of the cross. Is it for now that Jesus died on the cross, it's on our shoulders to, basically carry our own cross, our own cross of sacrifice. And then we have to sacrifice to make sure our kids are carrying their cross and being taught this salvation message. And what does the salvation message look like? And how does this play a part in our lives? We see it every Sunday, and it never seems obtainable. For me, when I go Sunday morning, it's you're not enough doctrine. You'll never be enough doctrine. You're a sinner, which means you're not enough, and you're constantly having to try to prove yourself that you are worthy of this everlasting love of the Father, instead of the same Father, everlasting love, giving you everlasting punishment.
Yeah, it's a messy topic, because it isn't, like I said probably a couple of podcasts ago now, like, it's not this black and white, clear-cut, cookie-cutter thing. It's, if we talk about how we see things from a Western perspective and an Eastern perspective, the East kind of looks for deeper truths. They engage with things. They want to feel it. They want to look at lots of different ideas and explore it and have a conversation around it. The Western idea is, can we break it down to its smallest common pieces, and then we know exactly what's right and what's wrong. That eradicates smallpox. That gives us books and teaches us education, and it gives us good healthcare, and it helps us build businesses. The Western perspective, this Greco-Roman perspective, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But when we are inquiring about things that we cannot break down to the smallest common denominator, right? When you're trying to break God down and try and tangibly kind of figure out, well, what is God? It's just not as easy, right? We look at the Bible and go, oh, well, what does the Bible say about God? Well, the Bible says a lot of things about God, and some of them are really awful, and some of them are really good. So what do we mean by what does the Bible say about God? How are we going to engage with that? And it immediately, if you're going to keep it as this black and white thing, you can end up with a really schizophrenic kind of bipolar God, who one day is really up, and then other days is really down, and you don't want to really cross him. Maybe just stay away from him in case he's on a down day. And so I think it's recognizing that this is a complex topic that needs engaged with, that needs explored together, We need to get together as groups of people and explore, what do you see? How do you see it? What do you feel when you experience God in this area? How do you see the Christ that lives in you? How does it perceive? We talk about the Bible being a foundational truth, but what's funny is Jesus doesn't leave and say, by the way, when I go, you're going to have a Bible that you can look at and it'll tell you what to believe. He says, when I leave, my spirit is going to live in you, and that spirit will lead you into all truth. And I can't even tell you some things right now. You're not in a place, you're not ready to hear what I have to say. So over time, the spirit is going to reveal truth to you when you're ready.
Well, and that's the interesting thing to me, because if you go to church, I just heard it this weekend. Somebody got out of service. They said, oh, the pastor talked about this new DIY salvation, and everybody thinks they can get their own doctrine and their own salvation, but they don't realize they need to come to church. Listen to me. I am the one who will help them. But see, that's not what Jesus preached. Jesus, just by what you quoted, almost made this individual doctrine of, we're going to work it together. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be in you. You're in me. Never about the church. It was never a doctrine about the church. There's a post, a pastor put this out. And this is what's just so frustrating me. It says how you can listen to your pastor's sermons. Top 10 ways that you can be committed to listening. Bring your Bible and turn off your phone and pay attention and let him reveal all these truths to you. And of course, a pastor's sending this out.
Of course.
And I feel bad for the pastors, right? That you'd have to kind of send out this, please pay attention to me.
Stop looking at your phone.
Right. And it's so frustrating. That's what I'm saying is, so pastors are putting out, hey, how to better listen to me. Pastors are putting out, don't go this DIY. Don't try to make this relationship personal with Jesus Christ. I've heard pastors say, don't go to conferences. Don't read other things. Don't read other doctrines. Don't go to other churches. Don't be influenced by anybody else than us.
Yep.
And then here we are saying, be influenced.
Yeah. Well, that's not the way we've historically operated. And so it might be the way we operate now, but it isn't necessarily the way we've always operated. And so that doesn't necessarily mean sometimes we get better at things. I don't know if you've noticed this looking through human history. Sometimes we really figure things out and we should stop doing what we used to do. But other times I think what was helpful for us for a season might not be an eternal truth. Right. And so there's an element of actually when we look at Protestant Reformation and we look at how it created stability, it helped us understand our individual relationship with God compared to, that's the funny thing, this Protestant Reformation that, we're kind of going, oh man, it's like the pastors don't want us to listen to anyone. That was founded on, no, you can have your own personal relationship with God. You don't have to trust on the church. And then the little pastors and the little churches became the new popes, and the Bible was the Pope, and and that was it. But it was the pastor's interpretation of the Bible that was the Pope, not the Bible itself. You read that Bible and you thought, oh, this is what it means. No. Your pastor will quickly correct you and let you know it means what he thinks.
Well, and even to think about, I look at the way it reads, and Jesus comes in and he tells basically the people who have created his temple, his rules, his regulations, and he starts saying, you're a whitewashed viper, or a whitewashed tomb, you're a viper. And basically it's the boss talking to his employees and being like, you're a worthless employee. How dare you say this? And I look at Malachi when it talks about you have mishandled the tithes and the offerings. You've robbed God.
Yep.
That was
the priests that are robbing God.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then you look at Matthew where he talks about, how wicked are you that put the law on people? How wicked are you that you teach this? How wicked are you that you say we need to do X, Y, Z, and you don't even do it yourself, and you're the wicked one? And that's impressive to me, because basically I read it as, if we are putting the law on other people, we're considered wicked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We live in a very black and white world, and this is part of just how humans have developed, so we have developed in a way that our culture has become very black and white. So the last kind of couple of thousand years, humanity as a whole, there's a whole branch of study called human psychological development, and it's how people develop psychologically. So you can look at a small baby, there's not much psyche there at all. They can't even tell the difference between their arm and a blanket. If they bite their arm and they bite a blanket, they can't actually tell which one's which, right? So that's until about 6 months, right? Babies there's not much happening in there for a while, right? There's a lot happening, but they don't have much psyche for a while. And then they slowly start to develop their own psyche. They start to realize, oh, ow, that hurt. Oh, maybe it's a hand. Huh. That doesn't hurt. Oh, maybe it's something else. It's not me. But even up until about 2 or 3, they can't tell the difference. They can say, oh, that over there is different from my body. But, you know, when I scream and my mum goes to get milk, I actually think I'm going to get milk. It can't even tell the difference between its mum and itself. It still thinks its mum is just an extension of itself. And so there's these developments. And then it starts to realize, oh, I have my own ego and I can get my own way. And it develops and it figures that out. And then it goes, well, me getting my own way, it's nice, but sometimes it doesn't work very well and everyone hates me because I'm screaming and yelling and saying no too much. And so there's a bit more stability and around that age of like, you know, 4 or 5 up until like, you know, early teens, they start to just kind of work as part of the family. They realize the rules, they accept the rules that are given. They're kind of like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay. Or they might ask why, but they quickly accept what mom and dad say is true. And then they develop as teenagers, right? We all know what teenagers are like. They start to realize maybe mom and dad don't know everything. And the painful truth is they're right. We don't. Yeah. But it sucks, right? Because suddenly they think they're know-it-alls and they know everything. And, you know, and then we develop again and we grow up a bit and we realize, oh, actually, mom and dad knew more than they were talking about and they did the best they could. And actually, I don't know everything either. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I'm not much better than the 5-year-old that used to ask questions, if I'm honest. And so we grow and we develop. And at different stages of our development, we can only operate the way we are. You know, you wouldn't look at a small toddler and expect them to operate the same way as you would a 28-year-old. You know, you would expect them to have different capacities to cope with pain, to cope with death, to cope with algebra. You know, like these are different people at different stages in their life. And it's not that you would say a toddler is worse than a 28-year-old. A toddler's just a toddler. Of course, that's what they're at. And so what's interesting is when you look at civilizations, they're just big groups of people developing. And so cultures develop in the same way. And so you look back to very early history, people were very, very primitive. And they weren't capable of very complex thought, very complex ideas and things like that. It was hard for us to conceptualize that. We can't really go back and imagine what that's like. My wife's a teacher. I'll give you an example. My wife's a teacher for small children. And so she has to teach them things like addition, like 2 + 3 is 5. And we can not really conceive what it is to not be able to figure that out. You know, I'm like, what? 2 + 3 is 5. Or I can look at my fingers and go 1, 2, 3, 5, right? But there was a time where that didn't logically make sense. You couldn't fathom it. And so we forget that there's times in history where they couldn't fathom certain concepts that we just take for granted now. And so the point being that as we develop, we go through these different stages. And the stage that we've been in for the last kind of maybe 2,500 years, it's called traditional stage. And it's a stage where society started to get rules and regulations, and it would put a king or a pope or a priest or a Bible or a code, a code of laws or something. That was the authority, and the society would do what it said. And it's because that's required when we mentioned in a prior podcast. When you go from living as nomads and kind of warrior tribes to like living as empires of a million people, you need some rules, you need some regulations, you're going to probably need some police, you might need some healthcare, you might need some government, you might need these kind of structures. And we still live in that stage a lot of the world. And the church is deeply at that stage. It really requires some rules and some regulations. And when you're at that stage mentally, when you're psychologically at that stage, and you'll notice when you have children in that age bracket, that bracket from like maybe age 4 up to about age 11, you know that rules and stability make them feel safe. And they need certainty. They can't cope with gray area. You know, you try and teach a 8-year-old, well, it's not really like that. It's just this big quantum gray area in the middle of these two options. And they just kind of go, they just kind of have a bit of a meltdown. They can't cope with these complexities. And so I think we have to have a bit of grace towards the church, where most people in the church probably are at this stage where they find their safety with certainty, security, rules, regulations. And so that's what their Christianity becomes. It's what their faith becomes, and it's natural. The problem is that maybe people like myself and you, Ben, and maybe some of the people who are listening, if you've listened long enough to this podcast, you're probably not at traditional stage anymore. The next stage after traditional is modern, and modern stage happened around the Enlightenment. And what it is it no longer finds value. Its chief value is no longer in stability and certainty and safety. Its chief value is finding truth and exploring and questioning. Okay. And so when, that lights me up, just those words, I'm like, oh yeah, you say safety and certainty. I'm like, meh, who cares? But you say exploring and questioning and finding truth. And I'm like, yes, let's do it. And so people that are at that stage are going to clash quite often with the church because the church is scared, right? So the pastor is scared of you using your phone in the service. Why? Because you're going to Google what he just said, right? So if he says, it's just clear, the Bible says, you're going to burn in hell if you don't say this prayer. And you can go, when did we start believing in praying a prayer to be saved? And it's like, we started believing when this guy did it at 1824. I don't take that date. I just picked one out. But, it's going to quickly highlight that some of the stuff your pastor says is just total BS.
Well, and also one of my friends has told me that a certain people that he goes into the service and he says he checks to see if it's plagiarized.
Wow.
And he says more times than not,
yeah, absolutely,
this guy's plagiarizing.
I have to hold my hands up. I've definitely repeated something I read in a book or whatever. We all do it to some degree, but right. there's people that literally will buy a sermon online and just read it to you. Right. And again, hey, somebody's, and I think this is the problem as well. So you and I are exploring doctrine and theology and these rich concepts of theology and philosophy, and that's exciting to us, and we spend a lot of time doing that. A lot of people don't have that time, and some of the people that we assume should have that time less than most. So often when we look at the pastor as the authority figure, the problem with the traditional model is we look to the pastor to have all the answers. Problem is, the pastor probably hasn't done much learning on different theological topics since seminary. And seminary, you've been to seminary, it's not that much data, there's not that much information, but this guy's busy visiting people in hospital. This guy's busy doing funerals for people that have lost their family member, and sitting with a family and loving them. This guy's, helping marriages that are breaking up and helping sit with them and encourage them and maybe give some insight on how to save this marriage. This guy's working hard. I mean, we rag on pastors. It's easy to rag on them with their terrible doctrine and stuff. But most of them, 90% of pastors are just really great people trying to help people. And
well, if I will give you a statistic, I did have.
Oh yeah, I would love some on this.
Well, this is not an official statistic, but I have talked to some people, and especially older people, and I says, out of how many churches you've gone to, of how many places you've served in networks, you kind of see these networks and they're elders to all of these pastors in these networks. And I say, what are kind of your view of good pastors, bad pastors, pastors doing the work, not doing the work? And they say 80% of the pastors are great. I mean, 20% of the pastors, I'm sorry, it's wrong. 20% of the pastors are really doing the work. It's the other 80% that aren't. And I was shocked by that, and this is by elders, review,
sure.
So and that was interesting to me. But, I think like what you were saying, though, is, how many pastors have gay friends? If they're secure in doing all of the work of the church all the time, they're not influenced by gay friends or gay family members or stuff like that. And so then it doesn't cause them to study. And if it doesn't cause them to study, then they just stick with the doctrine. And then maybe what if they did change their thought, but they knew the doctrine wouldn't allow them to accept that. So then they never say it because basically they feel trapped. How many people feel trapped in your doctrine of your church and everything like that? We had somebody who asked us the other day, they said, what do you think about being gay? And we're going to go to an extensive, on that. But my question is, and you even said this yourself, you said that you used to minister in evangelical churches and you got paid well, and you stepped out of that to be able to search more truth that you felt. And you kind of had this, man, I can't preach this anymore. This won't be accepted here. And it kind of would mess with your money. And you said, I would rather say truth than collect money. And
Absolutely.
You can quickly go back to that. Just start, milking down your word, And how many times are pastors just to collect that check? Not feeding their people properly or holding on to a doctrine. And I don't want to make a big case of that, but that's what I'm trying to say to people even listening today is the message you heard on Sunday morning might not be true because the pastor didn't study it, because the pastor wants to maintain this doctrine so he can keep that check going, Or he might not even believe it because he's dealing with his own family member being gay or just died, or,
But he can't say it.
But he can't say it.
And this is the thing, we forget, these pastors, most pastors come straight out of high school, they go to seminary, study for 4 years, become a pastor, maybe an associate pastor, youth pastor, they work their way up. And before long, they're a senior pastor of a church, they're making a good salary, 50, 60 grand, whatever they make. And they have a mortgage, they've got kids, they've saving for retirement, they're saving for, their kids to go to college, they're covering all their bills. And they then have a crisis of faith. And what do you do next? Because the truth is, if they come out about their crisis of faith, they start teaching differently, they're going to lose their jobs. But they can't go work anything else. They are qualified in zero, and there's some skills that you learn being a pastor for 20 years that were very helpful in a lot of different ways, I'm sure, but very few people are looking for that on their, resume. They're looking for, where's your degree in, whatever it is, engineering or doctor, whatever. And so they're left in a place where they go, I don't believe this anymore, but I've got to just stick it out because I got to pay the bills. I got to pay the mortgage. I got to feed my family. And so many people are just stuck in a situation. I talk with people daily that are in that situation, and it's really tough. And we work with how to navigate it and how to, hopefully move forwards. And it's tough. And, the thing is, we all look at the mega church pastors, and I think in America it probably is more prosperous. But the truth is, when you say I was making good money, I was making good money. I was making $30,000 a year. And now I make about $14,000 a year. So it was really good compared to what it is now. But I don't know many people that would say $30,000 a year is a fantastic amount of money. And I know a lot of pastors that a good amount of money for pastors. I know a lot of pastors in the UK that are making about $20,000 a year. And they're working their butts off.
Well, you said 40 to 60. We have pastors here, 150.
Oh, absolutely. And I know
like
it.
For 100 person church, 200 person church. I mean, and that was kind of my problem is like, where's the work of the church when the pastor's making $150,000 a year and there's no money for anything else?
Yep.
Side note. But you're right. There are a lot of pastors that don't get paid enough. And that's where I'm saying the challenge is what about that message in the pastor I'm challenging right now, that message in you that you want to get out, but you feel bound by the doctrine of the church you're serving? Yeah. What's more important?
Yeah.
The truth of what you believe or that paycheck?
Yeah. Well, we ultimately come down to that decision, isn't it? It's am I serving God? Am I serving truth? Am I pursuing truth? Or am I just trying to stay safe? And this is the hard part as well. We forget this, but the human mind is not wired for truth. We don't care if it's true or not. That's not what our minds are wired for. This has been proven in study after study after study. And it makes sense if we study how humans have developed over the, tens and tens of thousands of years. Sorry if that offends you. Over the 10,000 years, if that offended you. But, as humans have developed the mind, we've been wired for what is safe. And so when I am faced with something that makes me feel unsafe, I will disregard it. It's why we can so often give someone something that's true and they don't even hear it. It's like it goes in one ear and out the other. And we see this with religion, but we see it with politics. We see it with how we do our relationships. We see it in almost every area of life. When people feel scared, they disregard what's true that's making them scared and go back to what makes them feel safe. And so it's a real tension on how to do that journey, how to navigate that. So this is something I do with pastors as I work with them on how do we bring people on a journey. So one of the things I have talked about in recent years is topics like sex and sexuality, homosexuality, things like that. Or I've talked about, I'm trying to think of some other ones, God being violent or not violent, as the case I believe is. Different things like that, which are quite hot topics. Now, I knew that my audience, which was largely charismatic evangelical initially, and I had tens of thousands of people following me that were charismatic evangelical, and I knew that realistically, if I just started talking about these topics, it would be game over. They would just stop listening to me. We're done here. And so I was going, well, what do they want to talk about? What can I talk about that starts moving them forward? What baby steps can we do that's moving them in a trajectory that at some point they might be able to entertain having a conversation, not even accepting a different view, but having a conversation about this without feeling scared.
Right.
And so for me, what I addressed was the Bible. We talked about the Bible for about 2 years straight. And I probably, at the end of it, had lost about 20% of my audience. But I think that's a pretty acceptable loss in the grand scheme of things. The shift that's happened in my audience, where they've gone from more conservative, evangelical, charismatic, right through to being probably what many would consider quite liberal in the way that they read the scripture and approach things. And they maybe have plenty of conservative views. I'm not saying that that's their position politically or anything like that. I'm just saying they've grown and developed in how they might be able to have some of these conversations, where typically someone that's a conservative Christian can't have a conversation about this topic. Don't touch my tithing topic. Don't touch my Jesus dying. Don't touch my hell. People that have become a bit more, a lot of the people use the term progressive. I think that's quite an offensive term in ways, but struggle for terms for these things. But someone that's become a bit more open to having a conversation. Oh, tithing? Talk to me about it. I'd love to learn. I'd love to explore that with you. Even if I'm going to disregard it and say, nah, it doesn't sound right. I'd love to have a conversation. How do we move people from one way of thinking? So how do we move people from that traditional mindset that's looking for certainty and safety to a mindset that's going, I'd like to explore and find truth? That's the big challenge, and that's the challenge the church faces, and that's the challenge that people like yourself and I that are challenging people that are within the church. That's the challenge we have to make, because you can give them truth all day, doesn't make any difference. The challenge is, how do we move them psychologically to think differently so that they're excited by truth and not just driven by what makes them feel safe?
But I think it lives a little bit further than just safe. So I think if you were to say, I don't believe in hell anymore, it would almost be like you have to admit that you're wrong. Mm-hmm. One of the hardest things for me, just being vulnerable, is to tell my wife, I'm sorry, I was wrong.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because then it's like, man, I only just didn't miss it. I was wrong. Yeah. And then admitting that. But the greatest thing is every time I said, man, I missed it, I was wrong, the relationship goes up.
Yeah.
You know, and I think so that's kind of the thing is for a parent to tell their kid, man, sorry, I was wrong. For a man to tell his wife, man, I was wrong. For a pastor to tell his congregation, man, I was wrong.
Huge.
You know, and there's a lot of fear there. One of the reasons I left the church is because I was talking to the pastor about these ideas and things like that, and just couldn't get anywhere. I mean, for years I'm talking to him. And I was one of the leaders of the church. I mean, every church I did, I was the, senior usher. I mean, I was, prophetic. I'm giving sermons. I'm doing all the works, Mm-hmm. And then, I'm sitting there trying to make a roadway. And I realized this, it's his church. Mm-hmm. It's his business. Yep. It's his church. And that's what he feels God's told him to do. And I had to yield myself and say, I value that he believes that's his church, which it is. I value that he is the head. I value the doctrine he brings. I value him, because I found myself in the back of the church talking to the other ushers and being like, hey, what do you think about this? Hey, what do you think about that? And I didn't want to undermine him and his ministry, so I bowed out. Hey, I'm out of here. That was the reason I walked away from church. Now, I was not the pastor. You're dealing with pastors and, who are coming to you saying, man, you said that truth, and I saw that as truth, and I've always felt that was truth. And I've never been able to articulate it because nobody around me has been able to allow me to articulate it. Yep. Like you even said, you were rejected by 20% of the people that you've had common, conversations with on a regular basis, but you were still rejected. And not that they were more, right, nor were you wrong. It's just how they perceive it at the time that they perceive it.
Absolutely.
But where we're at today, how do you kind of see the future? Like for me, I see that a lot of millennials are not going to church.
Nope.
So for them, they don't have to reject much. Mm-hmm. So once the water's poured out, it's going to be like a water hydrant. It's going to... And I feel like the Spirit of God, for me, one of my biggest ahas of things, and I'm not necessarily saying it hasn't happened, but the scripture that just kind of brings total delight to me is my spirit will be on all flesh. Mm. That's like, what would it be like? Spirit of God moving around. And now here's the thing is I actually kind of think that it's already happened. Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm telling you, but to the degree of what would it look like if we accepted that the Spirit of God was on all flesh?
If we're aware.
What would it look like? And that's what I kind of feel like for me in judgment was when I was in church and the doctrine, I was judging everybody as a sinner. But what if I was judging everybody as the Spirit of God's on you? Mm-hmm. you are his child. You good. You know, like where you were talking about the first couple verses of, Genesis. You are good. You are good. You are good. You are good. Forget it. I'm tired of using good. You're great. You're awesome. You're amazing. You know what I'm saying? Like what if that was our neighbor? Mm-hmm. And that's what you kind of said, like with Jesus. Jesus is like, hey, stop looking at your neighbor as, is he under me? Is he above me? Can I pluck his eye out? Can he pay me? Can I kill him? Based on what you value your neighbor is. Value your neighbor as great. Value your neighbor is important. Value your kids. Value your wife. Value the people around you at work. Instead of saying, oh, I work a secular job. Yep. I'm not as good as the pastor because the pastor's. No, you are.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what I love about that as well? When they said, hey, Jesus, who is my neighbor? The example he gives, a terrorist.
Really?
The Samaritans were the local terrorists, right? When you're going through there, it was the worst of the worst, wow. of the skewed, wild kind of like sects in that area. And so for me today, it's like, there was a man walking down the street and he was mugged by some random thugs, and then a pastor drove by and he looked out the window and thought, oh man, that's a shame. But he was like, this is a sketchy neighborhood. I'm going to be next if I stop. So he kept driving. And then there was a Catholic priest and he drove by and he was like, well, no, I don't know. Like, I don't want to do that, And then an ISIS leader was walking down the street and was like, oh, I'm going to give this guy some money, get him in a hotel, make sure he's looked after. That's the severity of it. And that's what we're talking about. He's contrasting, here's the people you value, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, and then he's saying, and here's the people you hate. Because I couldn't think of anyone better for an American audience, right. An ISIS leader. And he says, that guy, that's the one you love. That's your neighbor. And that's wildly challenging. That breaks down most of our concepts of what it means to be a Christian. Because we don't have a paradigm in which we love those people. We figure out, how can I love those people?
We actually have a paradigm to hate those people.
How can we kill those people?
Hate gays, hate terrorists, hate drinkers, the drunkards at the bar. Hate them, and not only hate them, but punish them to hell.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's interesting. So this brings us right back to our cross conversation. So I want to go full circle here because I think this is an interesting topic as well, is what do we see as justice? What do we think justice is? Because I think there's a very common theme of what justice is throughout humanity, which is if someone does something wrong, they need to be punished for it. And that's the common theme throughout humanity. Pretty much any society you go into, someone does wrong to me, we punish you back. And then what typically happens is a cycle of violence, right? So you killed my cousin Bob, I'm going to kill your nephew, Stevie. And then you're like, well, you killed my nephew, Stevie, I'm going to kill your mom, Barbara, or whatever, right? And it escalates. And it's only when we come in with forgiveness that it de-escalates, it kills it. But there's a concept that runs right through the narrative of Scripture, right from the beginning. There's two concepts of what justice is. There's a concept that God is punitive. And what's interesting is mankind is only ever punitive, only ever wanting to do punishment when there's injustice. And there's a concept that God is like that as well. And that is in the Bible. There's no question about it. It runs through the Bible up until about Jesus. But there's also another picture of what God's justice could look like. And it's a justice that restores. It's a justice that heals. It's a justice that overturns the wrong and changes things. And to me, that's the voice of mankind validating themselves by painting a picture of themselves on God, and God showing up and going, no, I'm like this. And when Jesus shows up, he's very clear on which side of that equation he falls. And the New Testament,
I follow the Father. Right.
Exactly. And the New Testament is very clear on that as well. The Father restores, he heals. That's how he brings justice. In bringing justice, when Jesus is killed and it's proven wrong, what does he say? Forgive them. They don't know what they do. When he comes back to life and he's really proved them wrong, right? If you killed God and he came back to life, you'd be like, oh, this is not good, right? What does he say? The first thing he says, and it makes sense because you'd be scared. He says, don't be scared. Do not be afraid. Like Jesus comes back and he's like, don't be afraid. This is not something that I'm holding against you.
That's like punishment, right? Like if Jesus shows up, you're thinking he's coming back, he's going to punish me, an eye for an eye, life for a life. I took his life. I didn't try to protect him.
I turned out to be the ISIS terrorist in this scenario, right? Yeah. But then what does John say? John says in his book, he says, look, there is no fear in God. God is love, and there is no fear in God because fear has to do with punishment. As what's he saying? God cannot punish. It's completely, absolutely unable to operate on that paradigm. Now, what's interesting, so if we take a step back and we look at what do we know about justice in today's world. So when we look at the judicial systems in our countries around the world, we can look at how do jails work. And there's some really interesting examples. But generally speaking, how jails have worked over history is that someone does something wrong. Let's say someone murders someone, okay? They do something wrong. Now, that person murdered someone. What do we want to do? We want to make sure that they are not going to murder anyone else. So first things first, we want to remove them from society. Taking away any punishment or restoration, let's get them out of society. That's, like, generally speaking, a good idea, right? You don't send them into the kindergarten, you know? You just make sure they're out of society and then they're somewhere else. That keeps society safe. But that's not about punishing them. That's just keeping society safe. So that's always on the table. I'm not talking about, like, let's let murderers hang out in schools, or, you know, let's send rapists back into, you know, whatever situation they might rape someone. Like, I'm not talking about that, and that's always off the table. But generally speaking, we take someone out of society and then we incarcerate them for a certain period of time as punishment, or maybe we give them a death penalty, or we cut off their hand or their tongue in certain countries, but we punish them because you did something wrong. You steal in a certain country, hand off. In this country, you kill someone, we'll kill you in a certain state, potentially, if it's bad enough, you know? So there's a, you did something wrong, you're getting something wrong happening to you. You're getting something bad happening to you. And that makes it right. That's a punitive model. Now, what's interesting is there's a very different model on how jails and prisons can work. And so a lot of countries, especially in Europe, so this is very much explored, in Northern Europe has moved largely towards this model, and Western Europe is starting to move towards this model. And it's a model of restorative justice. And so people still go to jail. Well, let's get you out of society. You murdered someone. It is not safe for you to be around people. That's a good idea. Let's get you out of people's way. Let's get some knives off the table, get them away. Let's take away the guns. Like, you know, let's put you somewhere safe. But now, instead of punishing you, instead of beating you up, instead of putting you in a jail for 20 years or 30 years or 10 years or whatever a life is worth, because we can quantify that, you know, instead of doing that, and that makes it right, instead of doing that, we put them in a prison, and then we give them therapy. We talk to them, we connect with them, we give them purpose, we give them skills, we give them hobbies. We you know, most of them will have therapy every day. They'll have group therapy where they work with other people that had similar issues. We go, because the premise is there anyone that murders because they feel like murdering? Yeah, maybe actually yes, but why do they feel like murdering? There's still, if we can take a step back and a step back and a step back, it ultimately boils down to people have their own pain and hurt. Anyone that victimizes someone else has probably at some point been a victim that's caused them to think and feel and act like that. Maybe a tiny percentage, we're talking fraction of a percent, are actually psychopathic, where there's wiring in the brain wrong. Right. Okay, so maybe restorative justice might not work in that fraction of a percent. But
you would notice,
we're not gonna,
you would notice that fraction of percent by working with them on a regular basis.
And we're not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater for a fraction of a percent. That's insanity, really, to say let's not even explore it because it won't work on that, you know, 0.08% or whatever it is. No, the point being, the prison systems that have trialed this have saw extraordinary results, right? So in Norway, the restorative practices see a reoffend rate of 13%. If you come out of their jail, you're 13% likely to go in. 13% of the people will go back in. Do you know what it is in America where it's a punitive system?
I don't.
It's 87, I think, 86. Wow. The last percent I looked at was that. It might be a few years old now, but it is high. And this is the case across the world. Places that trial restorative practices, the reoffend rate plummets. People become ready to go back into society and to contribute to society. There was an example recently in London. There was a terrorist attack, and someone ran and jumped on top of this terrorist and confined them. What's interesting about it is this terrorist had been in jail and had been let out. You know who jumped on him? Someone else that had been in jail but had been through restorative practice.
Really?
And this person that jumped on him had murdered a young girl that he'd raped.
Wow.
And he turned his life around to the point where he gave his life. He died, I think, because he jumped on this guy who was stabbing people with knives. He jumped on him and held him down until the police managed to get there.
The London Bridge stabbing.
Yeah. He'd been through restorative prison. This guy that had raped, and I'm not saying that the fact he raped and killed someone doesn't matter. I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm not saying that he shouldn't feel bad for that. But trust me, he probably feels bad for that, especially if he's been healed up. Very few people, once they get healed up, feel good about the stuff they've done in their past. Anyone, you know, when you get saved, you look back on your life and you think, oh man, that doesn't make me feel great, you know? So I'm not advocating like we celebrate, you know, their crime or anything like that, but I'm just saying there's a different way to do it. Now, why do I say all of that? what I'm saying that for is that across the world, across Europe at least, it's starting to leak into some other parts of the world, but a lot of the world is much further behind Europe and the US. Across Europe, we're all shifting into restorative justice. America has its own problems because it makes money on people reoffending, and it's very privatized. So there's not an incentive to try and lower how many people are in prison. It's a very complex system. I don't mean to be political. I'm just saying there's complex reasons why they're not moving in that direction. But they've done their own studies and they found it works really, really well. So the point being that humans have looked at justice and they've looked at when people do wrong, what makes it right? And across the board, we're all answering the same question. Heal them. Restore them. Don't punish them. Restore them. Dig in deep, find the problem, and make it better.
Which really, in order to sit down with somebody and do therapy and do these programs and teach them, you know, you're saying you love them.
Yeah, you are.
You know,
it's beautiful.
You know, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, you're basically taking somebody that you know has done something wrong, violently wrong or whatever, and you're saying, I'm going to love you enough to restore you and give to you. I'm going to give to you my life and education to help you live a better life and education.
And it's funny because I was watching a video. There was a short video on, I think it's a project that they did restorative justice in Iceland. And there's these criminals, murderers, and they're like, you know, with like really sharp chef knives and they're preparing food for each other. And they live in like, they basically live in a big house and they live together and they hang out together and they cook for one another and they just like, it's just, they're free. They're free, but they're working on themselves. It's fascinating to watch. But my point being, if we as humans have looked at this situation and gone, this is a better way. It's better not to punish people because that doesn't change people, right? Anyone that's got kids knows walloping on the backside doesn't change them, right? And sometimes it makes them more stubborn and spiteful, right?
But it's easy for us to do that.
It's much easier, much easier.
And it puts the pressure on the kid to have to change. Instead of us having to change. You know, I mean, basically I could say, you need to make it right. Instead of me, like we talked about, giving my life to that child, giving my life to that prisoner, giving my life and saying, let's talk about why you did it.
Yeah. So if we figured that out, why do we think God hasn't? Why do we think that God at no point has come up with the idea that maybe he could just restore humanity? Maybe he could just work with humanity and change them and get to their deepest, darkest, broken parts and go, I could heal that. And this person would be an amazing, beautiful child of God in the image and likeness of me. Nah, I don't think so. I'm just going to burn him forever.
Yeah, but we see that. Every example you see Jesus working with people, right? The woman caught in adultery. Here's a great one. The guy filled with demons.
Yep.
Totally restored back to society.
And immediately told, go, like the guy, my favorite story, this is the man of the Gadarenes gets saved, right? I mean, he's wild. He's running around the neighborhood. He's eating people's cats and dogs. They're chaining him to the wall. Like, I mean, he's insane, right? And Jesus comes in, he casts out the demons, and everyone's like, whoa, that's insane. And to the point where they're like, Jesus, we'd like you to leave. That terrifies us. Imagine being so scared of a guy that just helped someone. That you helped the impossible to help case. You're so scared of that you're like, please leave. We're just freaked out.
Back to fear.
But what's interesting is the guy that got possessed, the guy that was possessed that got freed, he turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, can I follow you? And Jesus goes, no. There you go. That's Jesus' words on should you follow Jesus. Jesus says, no, don't follow me. He says, I want you to go into those towns and tell everyone what I did. I want you to tell everyone your story. Tell them what happened to you. And so it's fascinating. What's interesting is this town that chased him out it's called a Decapolis, which is 10 cities is what it means. It's sort of 10 cities in this region. And so they chased Jesus out. And Jesus said to this guy who was like, can I come with you? If they hate you, they're going to hate, I've just finished eating off all their cats and dogs, you know? And so like, you know, he's like, can I go with you? And Jesus like, nah, you stay here and then tell them about it. Go around and tell your story. The next time in the Gospels, chronologically, that Jesus returns, there's crowds waiting for him when he arrives. And you go, that's kind of cool. But so Jesus doesn't go, nah, you aren't ready. You know, if that was a church, right? If you had a guy that was like demon possessed, shaking around and eating things and screaming light at night, and you had to chain him up, right? First of all, that church probably should be looked at by like, you know, some state officials or something, probably, because maybe someone should go to mental health hospital or something. But, you know, if you had a church like that and the guy got saved and he got completely set free, Are you going to give him the sermon next week? No. You're going to maybe at a push let him stack some chairs, and then maybe after 6 months, you're like, oh, maybe you could welcome some people at the door and shake their hands. And then maybe after a while, you're like, okay, I think you could probably work with some of the youth, maybe. And bit by bit, but you are not going, all right, you're my representative for these 10 cities now. See ya. Bye. Right. That's what Jesus does with this person. Like, Jesus immediately sets people free and equips them to go and do something amazing.
He didn't send them to church?
Apparently not. There wasn't none. He became the church, right? Population, right. The crazy guy.
Right.
That was it. But yeah, so I think we need to realize that we are seeing our gods, we're seeing our gospel through our cultural concept, and this is a concept that has run through humanity. This is ingrained, right? And so no matter how long you believe humans have been around for, they've been around for a while, and the whole time from the beginning, we have dealt with something. Someone doing something wrong to me, I've responded in violence. And it's how we think God responds, right? So we mentioned Cain and Abel. Abel's blood calling out, punish Cain. You must surely punish him because he killed me. And God goes, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. That's not how I operate. And that's the voice of God consistently in the Old Testament going, I don't operate like this. Now, plenty of times people do something. They kill everyone and they go, God told us to do that. And God's going, oh, wow, okay. But that's what we do, right? How many times have we made some sort of decision and done something because we felt God say it? And how many times does that go well? Plenty of times. And how many times does it go disastrously and we're left going, wait, was that God? And so is it possible that we do things that we believe God's saying that aren't? I think that's a really reasonable conclusion. I've heard plenty of people say, oh, God told me to do this, and it's even gone well for them. But I'm like, I don't think God would tell you to, cheat that other businessman out of a deal.
It's the favor and blessing of God.
There you go. It's just favor, Right. He was not favored because he's a Lutheran
Right. He's not born again. And surely, and they even say like the wealth of the wicked turned over, to the righteous. Yeah. And I'm like, well, who's wicked? If Jesus died on the cross for all
saved
mankind,
the whole world. Right?
Yeah. Now who's wicked?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have all these dynamics, but I think we just need to be aware that we are bringing our culture to the table. We talked to this on your other podcast, Marriage Now. Is it Marriage Now What? Yep. So we talked about this where we see our culture and then we often conflate our culture with our religion. And so I was saying, as a European, I see some things about marriage and gender and raising children and stuff differently than you as an American. So a British person and an American have two different cultures. We still have the same faith of Christianity. We still follow Jesus. And so what it allows us to do when we explore that and talk about that is we can sometimes find that some of the things we thought were Christianity were actually just Americanity or Britishanity. Those are not words, but Britishism. And so the danger is that sometimes when we live in a bubble, we conflate what the bubble believes to be also true for our religion, and it might not be. If we're going to be honest, that Jesus comes to challenge the Roman Empire on some level. There's no question about it. Jesus would not have been crucified for doing anything wrong to the Jews. Crucifixion was solely for people that tried to that were subversive towards the Roman Empire, and if you would only be crucified if you overthrew the Roman Empire. It's why we know that thieves were not on the cross next to him. That's a mistranslation. The word is literally bandits, and that's it's a slur word, a Roman slur word that it's in Greek obviously, but it's a Roman slur word used for zealots that were trying to overthrow. And so the people that were either side of him probably tried to kill a Roman soldier, or were caught in sedition trying to raise up riots, or maybe they were some people that were following Jesus and were considered that they maybe are going to overthrow Rome as well. But the reason Jesus was crucified by Rome is because Rome thought he was trying to overthrow the Roman rule in that city.
Well, now, we see no fault in him because he wasn't trying to overthrow Rome.
Yeah, but they went with it. So whatever that looks like, we'll see. But the point being that that's why you get crucified. You're speaking against Rome, and he clearly speaks against Rome a lot. When you read through the Gospels, frequently he's making very political statements. The argument that Jesus is not political is such a lie used by politicians. It's brutal because it allows politicians to say, look, just ignore that Jesus part that seems to say what I'm not saying. That can't be political because Jesus wasn't political. Now just vote for me because you like it. It makes you feel good. It makes you more comfortable. It makes you allowed to go to war with the right person, or not like the right person, or better your family over another family, or whatever it is. So the idea that Jesus wasn't political is pretty poor, to be honest with you. From a scholarly perspective, you can't look at the writings. Very political. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Very political statement, because what's he saying? They're asking Jesus, hey, do you think Israel should be set free from Rome? And they're saying, like, should we pay taxes to Caesar? It's a common zealot position, is don't pay your taxes because this is our land. And Jesus is saying, no, who's on that picture of the coin? Caesar. Give that to Caesar. Give everything else to God. What's he saying? This land is God's. They don't belong here. Very, very radical position. Now, the scary part, my point in raising this, the scary part of that is that if there's a Roman Empire in this world today, who is it?
Us.
Right. It's scary. It's us in the West. It's us in the West that are asserting how we think the world should live. We're saying you should live this way. And we'll manage it and we'll police it and we'll make sure it's safe. And it is very safe and managed and good. And there's lots of good that comes from it and there's lots of bad that comes from it. But the point being, we fail to see our culture in this whole thing. And we fail to read at times that our culture is the thing that Jesus is challenging. Which empire do you have? Which God do you have? God or Caesar? What are you giving to Caesar? What are you giving to Boris Johnson if you're in the UK like me? What are you giving to Donald Trump if you're in the US like me? Like you, or I'm in the US right now, I guess. But and then what are you giving to God? What actually belongs to Donald Trump? What actually belongs to our government, right? And I'm not making a statement about libertarianism or left or right. Well, I'm just saying is there stuff here that isn't actually Christian? This is just cultural. I'm stuck in my bubble here.
Well, he didn't only challenge politically, he also challenged religiously.
Hugely.
And we totally missed that part. We think, it was an attack on kind of this false religion, but we don't realize if we are today's modern Rome, then what is the church also?
It's the modern Jerusalem. And what's interesting is we talk about Israel as a religious institute, but we forget that the religious institute was the political institute. There's one and the same, because they didn't have a political system. The politics of the nation were run by the Sanhedrin, the priests, right? And so it was one and the same. That's why the tithe, we often talk about tithes as 10%. That's not what they were. They were 20%, and then an extra 10% every 3 years went in as well. So you actually paid about 23% on average every year, if you flatten it out. Okay. Now what's interesting is we pay taxes that aren't too unlike that, but this is what it was. It wasn't actually for the priests. Some of it was. It fed the priests. They gave some land, but actually it was for the poor, for the needy. It made sure people had housing. It was a government social welfare program. The tithe, in some ways, right? It made sure there was a feast where everyone could eat. It made sure there was no lack. And so the church today taking 10% to run their heating bill and the mortgage on their huge property or whatever, that's not what Israel were doing. That it was a whole system. And so when Jesus is challenging them, he's challenging how much they've conflated God with their national interests. And that's a big challenge he's making, because his first sermon, when he goes into the synagogue in his hometown, which is interesting because there isn't a synagogue in his hometown, but it must be in his local synagogue, whatever it was. His hometown was about 100 people. They wouldn't have had a synagogue, It's probably just not worth building one. But he must have had a local synagogue, and it says he went in there and he picked up the scroll from Messiah and he reads it out and he says, this is a year of Jubilee, the blind eyes be opened, people should be set free that are in captivity, and all this different stuff. And he cuts that last bit. Now, the Jubilee text, which is what he's reading, the Jubilee text is exciting to Israelites. They read it every year for one reason, and one reason alone. It's all about Jerusalem and Israel being established as set free from all their captivity, and they're established as the great nation, and that God's wrath will be on anyone that opposes them. It's a wrath text against the Romans. And what does Jesus do? He cuts it out. He says, this is the year of Jubilee. You're going to be set free. You're going to have everything you ever wanted in this spiritual concept that you've created. And guess what? It doesn't include kicking the Romans' ass. It just doesn't. And they were livid. They wanted to kill him.
Because they wanted punishment.
They wanted to. It says they were amazed at his grace-filled words.
Wow.
And it doesn't mean amazed as in this is good, because it says, and they then tried to kill him. Right? So, but the point is, they wanted to kill Jesus because he was trying to remove their politics from their religion. So Jesus is very political. He addresses politics, but generally speaking, it's saying, why are we building empires when we should be building a kingdom of love? right? Why are we drawing borders when we should be bringing people in a hug? Now, I'm not trying to say anything about immigration and that, I'm really trying not to come across political in this, but we're talking about some sort of political elements where Israel are being very nationalistic, and Jesus is saying, you're not going to get to do that, to the point where he says, what does he say to his disciples? Go into all the nations. This is no longer the way we're going to operate. That's why Paul wasn't liked by the Jewish church. Paul, James, and John and Peter went head to head constantly, to the point where Paul and James were calling each other false teachers for a good portion of the New Testament. They didn't like each other. And the reason primarily, like Paul didn't like Jerusalem church because they were very nationalistic. They were all about their law. They were all about observing what Jews had always done. And they didn't like Paul because he was saying, you don't have to do that. You can do whatever, even if you're not a Jew. I don't care if you get circumcised. Just be a Gentile still. That's fine. And so there's a constant undercurrent here which Jesus is challenging. Whose kingdom are you building? Are you building your own kingdom, or are you building the kingdom of God? And I think when we conflate our bubble, whether it is my little church, my little town, my nation, my worldview, my politics, whatever it is, when we conflate that stuff with the kingdom of God, it's really dangerous, because now the kingdom of God is okay with me bombing an ISIS terrorist. Now, I'm not saying you've got to figure out how to do ISIS terrorists, obviously, right? I'm not saying we just leave them alone, or, we ask them to come around for dinner. Like, it's complex. I know it's complex, but I don't think Jesus says it's okay to kill them. I don't see Jesus advocating killing anyone anywhere. So we got to figure out something. We got to look at something. I realize I'm opening a huge can of worms with talking about this, especially when I'm sure most of your audience are very American.
Well, and I can see both sides of the story. I think that's kind of the unique perspective for me is, I can see Democrats saying, let's build, take down the wall. And I can see Republicans saying, let's build the wall.
Oh, I didn't even think of that analogy. Okay.
But it's kind of, same way. Like, there's abortion, not abortion. There's, death penalty, not death penalty. Like, I can freely take all the information in. I had a guy actually get vividly shouting. We were on the phone, and he's like, what do you believe on this? And I'm like, man, I don't really have a belief on that. And he's like, you have to. And I'm like, why?
We're so dualistic, though. It's either right, wrong, in, out, yes, no, black, white. That's how we see everything. Yeah. And it just isn't necessarily a very helpful way to look at things, because like I was saying in another podcast about Jesus approaching third way views. So when Jesus is hit, it's will you hit him back, or will you do nothing? And it's like, how about I do this third option, which is doing nothing, but it really hits him hard where it hurts. I've not hit him. And so I can respond, but not in the same kind. I can respond to your violence and fix your violence, but I'm not going to resort to violence like you do, right? And so I don't know, a kid kicks you. You don't kick them back, do you? But you might restrain them. You might go, hey, we're going to stop kicking people right now, and we're going to talk about it. So there's a third way here. We don't have to just do nothing, and we don't have to respond the same way that the ISIS terrorist does, right? Because that's not really fixing the cycle of violence.
So let me ask you this. I mean, basically we've got, the cross, and we've kind of talked about different beliefs and stuff like that. What do you kind of consider that would be our modern day consideration of what the cross is? How do you think we should view that? I mean,
I think if your concept of the cross is working for you, that's okay. Right. I'm not pushing people to change, but I think as we grow and develop in our understanding of who God is, and as we grow and develop a society to understand that love is the answer, that love is the way, which is surprising when God is love. But as we grow in that way, we start to look at certain paradigms we've had of God that are more they've been with us for longer, and they've been developed in prior stages of ways of seeing God, and we look at them and go, that doesn't really make sense to me anymore. And I think as that's happening more and more, we're going to start reframing the cross in a way that makes more sense to us. And for me, I think that the cross is not a demonstration of God punishing Jesus instead of punishing us. For me, I see the cross as a demonstration of God going, you're stuck in a cycle of violence. When you're faced with something you don't like, when you are faced with something that challenges you and points out your sin, you ostracize it, you scapegoat it, and you murder it. Let me highlight that to you the best way I know how. You're going to end up doing it to God. So I'm going to come to you as God. I'm going to show you the path. I'm going to point out your issues. I'm going to give you a better way, and you're still going to kill me, and I'm willing to be killed. That's okay. You do that. I forgive you. You don't know what you do. But once I come back, you know what you do. And this is why we've seen, since the cross, we have seen a radical shift towards a less violent world. Now, we still had crusades, and we've had horrific things, and we've had Europe ravaging through America and wiping out pretty much everyone that was here before. You know, I mean, we've had really violent stuff done in the name of God even. But we are moving in a trajectory of less violence, and we are moving in a trajectory of, oh, maybe God is different. Maybe God is wanting to restore. Maybe God is wanting to heal. Maybe God does want to turn the other cheek and love the enemy. And so I think we're going to shift in that direction, and we'll continue to grow, and we'll continue to develop, and we'll continue to see new facets of the cross. It's like looking at a gem. You know, you can turn it and look at it under the light from different angles, and you'll see it slightly different. And I think the cross is exactly like that as we grow. There's a story. Let me finish up with this, okay? So there's a story I mentioned Narnia in one of my prior ones. So there's a book called Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis, which is one of the Narnia stories. And in it, one of the young girls hasn't seen Aslan, who's the picture of God, of Jesus. And she hasn't seen Aslan for a whole year. And she comes back to this Narnia world, and at one point she meets Aslan, and she says, Aslan, you've grown. He's so much bigger than she remembers. And he says, you've grown. And he says, no, child. He says, I don't grow. He says, but every year you grow, you'll see me bigger.
Wow.
And I think this is the picture of the cross. This is the picture of God. That God's not changing. He's always been good. He's always been kind. He's always been gracious. He's always been love. He's never been pro-violence. He's never been trying to get a one-up on us or needs to punish us so he can forgive us. Does God need to kill something to forgive you? Is that really how is God? Did God make his own rules so limiting? You know? And I don't think God's ever been like that. But in our mindset, God has been like that over time. But every year we grow, we see God bigger. Every year we grow, we see his love even more. And I think that's the trajectory that we're moving as humanity. And that excites me. And it frustrates me when people aren't seeing it and aren't growing. But we all are in our own path, on our own trajectory. Hopefully similar trajectories, but you know, it takes time. It takes time.
Well, I know for me even, the cross was important to me. You know, it was my salvation. It was, you know, but I remember the time I thought that God didn't only forgive me, he forgave the whole world. And that was like, you know, because I thought for a long time it was God only forgives those who ask for the forgiveness, you know. Yeah. And I realized I realized that it's not up to us to ask for the forgiveness. God can forgive us without us asking for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I realized that's when God looked bigger to me, and he started becoming bigger and bigger and bigger through grace.
Yeah.
And so in closing, stay tuned, because we're going to start doing some grace episodes and just kind of talking about that revelation of grace and how it's changed, you know, the view of doctrine, you know, basically with new eyes of love and mercy and grace. So Wonderful. Go ahead and close out with your information.
Awesome. So you can contact me on Instagram or Facebook, preferably Instagram. I'm more active on there. It's just Phil Drysdale, PhilDrysdale. And on Facebook, it's Phil Drysdale Ministries. And if you want to get into great depth on some of the topics I talk about, I have like really in-depth videos on thegracecourse.com. It's all free, and some of these videos are, you know, like I think one series is 17 hours long. It's really in-depth. And so if stuff that I've said sounds good and you're like, oh, I want to go into that in a bit more depth, thegracecourse.com is a great resource, and it's all free, like I said.
Thanks for joining. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.